Sometimes you wonder whether simply breathing in this country might one day come with a price tag. Even accessing the most basic human need like water is increasingly tied to cost. And nowhere is this more visible than in housing. Finding and keeping a home in Britain has become one of the greatest challenges of our time. We've seen an explosion in private landlordism, yet prices keep rising. The question is, where does this leave the role of social housing? Have housing associations shifted from their original social mission to a more commercial outlook, thriving at the expense of low-income households? Welcome to That Talk with me, your host Ripon Ray. Today, we're tackling one of the most urgent issues in social policy, the cost of housing. To guide us through this discussion, I'm joined by a distinguished guest, Assia Awaleh from Sapphire Independent Housing, with over 15 years of experience in the social housing sector. Assia brings first-hand insight into the struggles facing both tenants and landlords. Let me ask Assia. Assia, you worked in the social housing sector for more than 15 years. Let's start with the basics. What is the original purpose of social housing in Britain, and how did we get to rely on it so heavily after the Second World War?
Hi, Ripon. I think that's quite an interesting question. I guess the origins of social housing were kind of altruistic, but also quite capitalist. So they were often seen as like the original purpose was seen as like workhouses. So I guess employers would purchase properties in cities. It could be London. It could be any kind of major industrial city. Think your Londons, your Bristols, your Cardiffs. And they would have workhouses for their employees. So I guess the original purpose was to provide housing for workers who originally probably would have lived in more kind of agricultural areas. As you said, it's a basic need. You can't go to work if you haven't got anywhere to live. And over time, it became more important because I guess the Industrial Revolution brought with it greater need for workers, and I guess it was probably more kind of the Christian element of it that meant that the conditions of those workhouses were kind of looked at. So not only were workers housed, but I guess the Christian kind of idealism of it all was that they were to be housed in kind of nicer conditions. Over time, those workhouses would have been transferred to probably charitable organisations. We're looking at maybe something like an Origin Housing Association. Peabody was kind of one of the founders of that, as was Guinness. So these landlords that are still around today, some of our bigger landlords as well. And I guess over time, they would have transferred all of those assets to those housing associations, who would have, over time, shifted from shared accommodation to more family and self-contained properties. Because I guess the way that we've lived over time isn't so much that you want just a room to live in, you want a home as well. So, those properties would have been improved over time to have, it sounds ridiculous, but indoor plumbing, bathrooms, and then I guess the number of properties that you could have would reduce because you're making it from, I don't know, a 7 or 8 bedroom house to maybe 3 flats. So I guess that's the origins of social housing. And then I guess after the war, we would have had local authorities build housing because private homes would have been bombed. And the average person in the UK doesn't have the means or ability to rebuild that home. So it would have gone from probably a 2-tier system then. So it would have had like the local authority, workhouses, parish homes as well. Don't forget the Church of England is one of the biggest homeowners in the country, to then local authorities building homes because of, I guess, the destruction of the war. And they would have built council houses and housed local residents. So I guess it's always had a localism aspect to it. Even today, you have to have a local connection to be eligible for local authority or housing association properties. because it's meant to be for the people that live locally. So I guess that's kind of the broad landscape of social housing and the purpose and origins of it.
I mean, in terms of post-war housing to the policies of 1980s, what major shifts have shaped the housing landscape?
I think come the 80s, we were kind of used to living in our own homes. We wanted home ownership's a real British concept, and I think the people that lived in council or housing association properties didn't own their house. And Margaret Thatcher obviously brought in the right to buy with massive discounts. So I guess one of the biggest shifts in that kind of era, which had positive and negative effects, was that the positive aspect was, yes, you can buy your council or local authority home, and the government will give you a helping hand in that. But it also means that that once publicly owned asset is now privately owned. And I think the statistic of it is something like in London, especially in central London, 60% of properties that were once council homes bought through the right to buy are now rented out in the private sector. So I guess the ethos of it was, let's give people a helping hand onto the property ladder. And the reality is now that asset is now in private hands, being rented back out to probably the same people that need to be housed. So it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, is it not? But not in a positive way.
Social housing, which is what you work within, is often described as affordable. But how is that affordability actually achieved, and how do council rents compare with housing association rents?
So affordability is something that is always relative because it's down to each individual circumstance. I'd say from a housing association perspective, all rents are within the affordability of either universal credit or housing benefit. So if someone is not able or does not have the means to pay their own rent and service charge, it will be paid for by them. So in that aspect, it is affordable. But I think if you look at the benefit system as a whole, is it enough to live on? I would argue that it's not, because once you take into consideration the cost of utilities, be it gas, electricity, water, if you're on local authority housing benefit or universal credit, you should be eligible for council tax relief. But can you pay for your utilities? Can you afford to travel within London? London is the city that I live in and work within, and the cost of groceries. I would argue that it's not affordable, but the housing element would always be affordable. And when you look at housing association rent versus local authority rent, there's different models. So like some housing associations have had large stock transfers from local authorities. So those rents would always be capped at the same as a local authority rent. But even if you look at affordable rent, which is meant to be 80% of the market rent, most landlords are not charging 80% of market rent. If you look at the cost of a one-bedroom flat in London versus the cost of a one-bedroom flat in a similar location from a housing association, it's probably 60%, 50% of what the local market would charge. And we're quite sensitive to cost. In lockdown, we gave some of our residents rent-free periods because we're sympathetic to the fact that some people were furloughed or were unable to work or had other financial challenges. So, on an individual basis, we had a pot of money set aside where we could give people rent-free periods. It's not just rent. There's lots of other things that local authorities and housing associations help with. We've got employability training. We have apprenticeship academies. We are encouraged to employ our residents. So I think there's a lot of value added to the community when there is housing association and local authority housing, other than just the housing.
Many landlords face difficult choices about maintaining older homes that require high levels of investment. How are these decisions being made, and who bears the cost?
Ultimately, it's the housing association or the local authority. What you'll find is in the next, I'd say 3 years, 4 years, and you've already started to see it, especially in housing associations, that they are, like, especially large housing associations. Like if you look at Notting Hill Genesis, they had a they had a huge privately owned and market rent subsidiary that they are selling because of Arab's law and kind of the effects of post-Grenfell regulation. We're having to improve our properties. We're having to look at fire remediation. I'd probably say we're at the tail end of it. But if you look at Arab's law, every single one of our properties has to be in a good habitable condition, which shouldn't be a stretch. It should not be a stretch to say your home should not have damp and mold. But for a lot of older properties, especially looking at Victorian properties in London, we're at a sweet spot. We've got not enough construction workers. The cost of materials has gone up, and now we're having to remediate all of our properties. So what you'll find landlords doing is saying that maybe we can't invest in building, or increasing the number of properties that we've got. We've got to make sure that what we have is fit and healthy. Now, there are some funds that we can apply for. So there's some government funding around net zero carbon. So if you need to, retrofit secondary glazing in properties because it's in a conservation area and you have to have the sash windows, you can apply for some funding. But by and large, the cost of improving, it sounds crazy to say improving a property to not have damp. I'd say the cost of kind of remediating the issues is going to be borne by the housing association. I touched on earlier that we're not for profit, so we don't have to have lots of money left over at the end of the year, and give it to our shareholders. We're not set up in that way. So any money that we do have, we should be reinvesting in our properties. And housing benefit and universal credit shouldn't be kind of looked down on. It is one of our biggest income generators because a large proportion of our residents are in receipt of those benefits. So using that money to improve their properties isn't, I don't think, too much of a push.
For landlords, letting two households dependent on benefits is often described as risky by nature. What is that, and what impact does it have on tenants in need?
I think in the private sector, it's seen as risky because you probably have these kind of front of the newspaper image of landlords, being left without their rent being paid and their properties being damaged. In social housing, it's not an issue. If someone's on, benefits, whether in full or in part, it's part of their affordability assessment that we all do, and we take into consideration that you've got to remember that a large number of our properties has to go to people on local authority waiting lists. So to say that those individuals that are in need should not be on, state benefits is a real challenge. I don't think that's even realistic. I guess some of the risks are if people are in and out of work, so unstable work. So we're looking at maybe a few years ago, a large proportion of our residents may have been on 0-hour contracts. That's a real challenge because their benefits then fluctuate, which then would mean that the housing cost fluctuates, and it's about budgeting for the individual then. So it's for us to work with them to budget and to make sure you don't want to discourage anyone from working. You want people to work to improve their kind of personal outlook and their kind of personal finances. But you've got to make sure that it doesn't jeopardize their home. So if we know that a resident is in 0-hour work or is in irregular work or seasonal work, it's just helping the budget. But for us, we know that they're always going to be in arrears because housing benefit and universal credit is paid in arrears. So what we do is we look at the point at which their universal credit or housing benefit is paid, and then what's the balance then? If it's reduced down to 0, then there's no arrears. But if there's a balance, then there is arrears. And it's not, we're ultimately landlords. We rely on rent. It's not, I don't think it's shameful to say that. So if an individual is struggling to pay that rent, then they should work with us. There are times where, people are falling into such, large sums of arrears that we're having to take them to court to recover our property. But it goes back into that same pool of renting it out back to people in need who may be on benefits. I don't think it's, embarrassing or shameful to say that as a landlord, we rely on rent and we expect our residents to pay their rent. But if they fall on hard times or they struggle to pay it, we try and work with them.
When inevitability does occur and housing associations face financial pressure, what strategies are they using to recover cost, and How does this affect tenants?
I think it's difficult because ultimately it depends. You've got mixed use sites, so you might have a development, particularly in cities where part of it might be shared ownership, part of it might be privately owned, and part of it might be rented at affordable rents, for example. So in that instance, you try and apportion any kind of scheme costs relevant to each kind of housing need. But there will be times where the service charge increases because you've got to look at some of these whizzy new schemes. I think if you look at ones with concierge, underground car park, CCTV, electronic, gates, these are all things that are expensive and expensive to not only install but maintain. So ultimately, who bears the cost of maintaining and repairing those, I guess, assets? That's the residents. But as we touched on earlier, if you are on universal credit or housing benefit, that cost is absorbed by the local authority housing benefit team or universal credit. It's not direct; it is directly attributed to you. But if you pay your rent and service charge, then you will pay it. If you are relying on state benefits, then you won't.
And finally, Assia, before we close, I'd like you to share your top tips for campaigners, let's say, who are working to improve housing condition. And from your perspective of social landlords, what should campaigners focus on?
I think it's an interesting time that we're in right now. If I put my kind of campaigning hat on, be part of the change. I think it's easy to look from the outside and point in and say you need to do better. But I would say, become board members, sit on local authority panels, try and become, part of the system that kind of manages and shapes local housing. Consider becoming a local councillor. From a housing perspective, I would say you will see improvements in the condition of properties without a shadow of a doubt. There are some very stringent rules coming in to play come, I think, the 27th of October with Arab's Law, with some literal deadlines that landlords have to meet. For now, it's only in local authority and housing association properties, but I've got a feeling it will extend to private landlords because it shouldn't matter whether someone lives in a Peabody property or, their landlord owns it. If it's got damp and mold and the windows aren't, sufficient, they should be improved. So I'd say campaign for an extension of Arab's Law to any landlord, whoever it is, because you'll just see the quality of properties increase. But then there's going to be a bit of take. As I touched on earlier, people are not focusing on expansion. They're shoring up what they have. So, you're not going to find the level of development that we have. So there's a balance, isn't there? We need more homes, but we need the quality of the current properties to be kind of improved. So landlords now are kind of finding out what that sweet spot is and what that looks like. But I'd say, be part of the change, become a board member, sit on local housing advisory panels, be involved in the local community. If there's a landlord, whether it's a social landlord or a private landlord, you've got to remember that the Duke of Westminster is the biggest private landlord in the country. He's got a board. There is a panel that meet. There is a charitable trust. Become part of the campaign to sit in something like that. To try and make a difference from within, because I think only through collaboration are things genuinely going to improve, and also all voices are heard. That's it, really.
Thank you, Assia. I'm very grateful for your insight actually into the world of housing. Assia Awaleh from Sapphire Independent Housing. For those who are listening, and if you'd like to share your stories, you can email me at ripon@debttalk.org. Join me next time when we'll tackle another pressing issue, the cost of digital exclusion. You've been listening to Debt Talk with me, your host, Ripon Ray. Until next time.